All right, welcome to another episode of New Wine Uncorked. As always, we are stoked that you are here with us. I'm Matt Farlow, Phil Berlin, and Tony Wynn are joining me as always again. And for those of you that have not subscribed yet, you're watching this on YouTube or you're seeing this play out maybe on your phone or through Facebook, make sure you go to YouTube and hit subscribe for our YouTube page, the New Wineskins YouTube page, because then every time a video is dropped, whether it's New Wine Uncorked, we also have other videos, New Wine Tastings with Dr. Metzger, as well as New Wine Table Talks live on Thursdays. That's at 1 p.m. Pacific time. And then after those get done, we also upload those to our YouTube page as well. And so when you subscribe, you get those. And then like our Facebook page so that when dudes like Tony or when Phil or myself or Paul Metzger or Brad or any one of the Trudy Sang, any one of the New Wine leaders puts a post out there on Facebook or has something going on, you're invited to participate with us. And you get to get into some neat stuff. We were just talking, because Phil is a couple blocks away from where the Proud Boys were this weekend, you know, and they're, I'm sure, Phil, for you, if you went out there and hung out with them, they'd be very welcoming to you because I'm sure that's where they were there for, right? Proud Boys, right? And so this group, and we're continuing this talk about, like, how do we engage this? And last week we were talking about the economy and financial, and how is it that we consume one another? And this week, what is it that we sell ourselves to? What do we prostitute ourselves? You know, Jean-Paul Sartre said about the church that your church is a whore, and she whores herself out to, you know, sometimes the lowest bidder, you know. And it's interesting in the wake of everything that's gone on over this weekend with Trump and the taxes and everything, we start to see, is he doing the very same thing that we're accusing the church of doing, prostituting ourselves out? Is he doing that? And that starts to get into some very problematic issues if that's the case. If it's the case that he's that in debt with other countries coming into America, how could they, arguably the single most important position in America, that is the president, and if he's in debt to people, would he be willing to prostitute himself out, and at what lengths? Because we all do it on a small level each day, you know. And so how is it that we sell ourselves? And so the question is with you guys, because you both have extensive responsibility and interaction and experience with the church, as well as with like the Portland Rescue Mission place, and now with your doctoral work, Phil, with this specifically with the church and looking at gentrification. Even people who have been pushed out and oppressed, we still, like in those certain situations, they still will allow themselves to be prostituted, meaning that they will sell themselves out just maybe even for one step more on that ladder of societal value. How does the church combat that? How do we, like, where do you see the church selling herself as a whore to society as well as individuals? And how do you think it impacts our life on a daily basis?
Wow. I got two ideas are coming to mind. The first is just, and this is a consistent thing and not limited to the church, but I think it kind of narrows itself in relationship to the church. But the idea that we want to be right is the thing. We will do what we need to do in order to be right. And the other is the idea of maintaining power, maintaining control, maintaining authority. Those two things have become a thing. So in relationship to authority, first off, the idea that we're going to say that we don't introduce new voices into the conversation, that we have, you know, we're in the middle of a COVID thing, we have kind of a civil uprising happening in our city, and then we're not believing the other voices and stories that are within the church. We're bringing them maybe to talk for a couple of weeks, and hopefully we're going to move back to our agenda next week, because this is all in the context we want things to be normal again, right? But we'll entertain the conversation for 1 week. Next week, go back to our regularly scheduled programming and not allow this to be a part of our life. But the notion of being right when it comes to God, and just thinking that, yeah, this is the way Christians do life. We're going to get together, we're going to sing out loud, we're going to listen to a man preach, and then this is how God teaches the world about him. This is how the gospel is witnessed. And that doesn't have to be how the gospel is witnessed. There's so many different ways. In particular, you know, just going out serving is a way that we could be witnessing. Is a way that our body ends up telling that same story. But just those two things, it seems like we will give just about anything to continue to be right and continue to be in power to whatever length we can.
Yeah. I, as a PSA, I'm forming an anti-Proud Boys coalition called Ashamed Men. Because so ashamed of Proud Boys and their actions. So if anybody wants to join, look for the Twitter handle. It'll be there soon. Ashamed Men. We'll be hosting conferences all along the East Coast and West Coast. No, just joking aside. Yeah, in digesting and thinking through, Matt, what you're talking about us selling ourselves and the language of prostitution and how the church throughout scripture has been identified, or throughout church history has been identified as whoring herself out, or throughout scripture God's people have been identified as the unfaithful wife. I think I sit at this liminal space of where I try to understand how much of that is toxic masculinity and patriarchal language of, yes, the church's, God's people and the church are portrayed as a female, but I think there's something to be said about us abdicating responsibility when we say we sell ourselves, and then we feminize that as derogatory of women. And so, I mean, to really go left field and make everybody uncomfortable, I think where we sit right now as Christians in America, our lust of power and our pursuit of power is less about how we sell ourselves, but it's more masturbatory. It's self-flagellation in the sense that we produce our own stash and get high on it too. Like a recent Atlantic article came out about how Trump has repeatedly behind closed doors and with his closest advisors talked about how conservative American evangelicals are hustlers. They're grifters. They're scammers. And for Trump, game recognizes game. And so he understands the con that American evangelicals are running, and he respects that because he himself is running a long con. It's come out that what Trump admires about Joel Osteen isn't what Joel Osteen preaches. It's the multi-million-dollar media empire that Joel Osteen runs. Trump will ask, how does he get the viewings and the ratings that he gets? Because Trump admires that. And so I think when we talk about the masturbatory like cycle that we find ourselves in with that type of powers, Trump lusts after the power that evangelicals lust after, and it's cyclical. It's self-feeding and self-perpetuating. And so I would say it's not that evangelicals and American Christians have sold themselves out. It's that they are self-pleasing. They are pursuing what they want. And now it's just a matter of, are they willing to be explicit about what they want? It's very much pornographic. When you watch Fox News is very much pornographic. It may not be sexual, but there is this self-consumption that is taking place. So yeah, I think the language of the church whoring herself out needs to be interrogated and in some ways deconstructed and reconstructed. But the language that I find right now that's useful is, yes, that very visual, very graphic, in some ways very carnal language, but I think it desensitizes our complacent evangelical conditioning, because we need to be offended to be destabilized. But Yeah, if anybody has contentions, I'll go watch some Promise Keeper videos and I kiss dating goodbye. I don't know.
The question would be, is do you watch Promise Keeper first and then Fox and then go back to Promise Keeper, or is it Fox, then Promise Keeper? I agree, because the porneia, the inappropriate use of love, right, turns into this lustful desire. My question, and it goes back to a few weeks ago too, because Tony, you brought this up, that power is more intoxicating than drugs. And you're guessing because you said you never done drugs. you know and I mean, I haven't done drugs. I took a hit, never inhaled. I'm in the Clinton-esque camp. But it is true, power is exceptionally enticing. It exceptionally sexy. So, but Phil, do you think that power and authority are one and the same, or it's like people seek after authority first, then power, or power and authority, or do they not even know what they're seeking after?
Yeah, I don't think it may bind it to control, you may bind it to voice, you may put it in any of those spheres, but it just really comes down to, yeah, man, who's kind of running the table, who owns the pond, who controls, sets the terms of the conversation, and those things are kind of just all bound together. And I think we can see in a way that that we can live with those powers, but then just the notion of divesting of those powers, being able to share that table and give up that space is a very foreign thing to anyone, really. But in the church, it's really more interesting, because our model did just wandered around with his creation and allowed his creation to murder him. Like, what are we doing here? What are we doing here? How are we not modeling that? And I guess, we have traces of trying to model that by our acts of charity and the like, and our consistent invitations to allow people to speak into particular things, but it's just not, it doesn't seem to be what we're known by. We're known by being a people that, yeah, just by being entwined with the power and the like. And as Tony mentioned a moment ago, we're known for being in the middle of that kind of spiral of how we use power and benefit from it. And it is sickening as we watch. So yeah.
It's interesting, I think, with the power play, and it's interesting that you brought that up, this idea of the pornographic, Tony, because I feel like if we started dealing with the realness of these situations, like I was teaching a class today, and I was telling the students that if we don't deal with sin, it's like a shit stain that just stays there, and it it just ends up turning into a rash, and because you don't get rid of it, because it's not meant to be there. It's like the eternal wipe. You just can't get rid of it over and over. That's the sin, and that's what politics have become, is this push into authority, into power, like Phil, you're saying. I think that's brilliant. And Tony, I totally take your point that it's not so much that we sell ourselves, right? But even just a giving. And the question is what is the church's response? Like, what does the church have to look to then if you've got some of the biggest names, Joel Osteen? I mean, it used to be Bill Hybels. But I don't know what's going on with Willow Creek, right? They try to kind of not make it public, so they don't want to, push out that church. But that church has been under leadership that literally was, selling into prostitution. I mean, seriously. And so take your with the use of that imagery. Absolutely, we don't want it to be defaming or degrading towards women, because the church already has a long history of that as well as pushing out folks of black and brown. So I think we need to be mindful of that. My question always is then what is the answer? Because God still talks about authority, giving you authority on earth, and you are called to have. My daughter's taking a class right now in her theology, and this guy is just talking about dominion is more than just this peaceful stewardship. It's like, no, you are called to rule, like this authority over the land. And the way in which he's pushing it, though, it makes it seem like, because he takes Satan out of the garden and says it's more of a self-fulfilling prophecy, that we turn to self, that it's not Satan who tempts us. And the problem I have with that is that then we take away that aspect of Satan and evil that the Bible always talks about. But then we're not fighting the cosmic battles at their level. I totally agree, authority of power, but if we're not seeing the truth of who God is, this cosmic battle going on, then how does that get injected into our lives today? And then when you talk, Tony, about the pornography of the media and stuff, people are like, oh, what is he talking about? Oh, yeah, of course he is, because he's anti-Trump. So of course then, anything, and it's just because I'm not anti-church, I'm not anti-Trump, I'm not anti-politics, but gosh darn it, if we're not critiquing ourselves and asking questions, then how can we go to that next step? Everyone's talking about, oh, we need to make things great again, right? Make things better. Regardless if you're black or if you're white or if you're brown, we know that this is not good enough. This is not okay. Now, the perspective that we take, though, that's determinative of the future we're going to. If I look back and say, oh, yeah, back then, I want to be great again like that, well, that's the perspective I'm going to lead to. And my problem I have is I feel like that's a lot of the leadership of the evangelical church nestled with Trump in the hustling and saying, ooh, we can make this great again for us. And that us tends to be the white male. And unfortunately, they have the same look as me. And so I'm like, dudes, the Proud Boys are nothing to be proud about, but how do we combat that? Because my own personhood, though, is drawn into having authority and I have to have authority in my own life, and I have to have power over sin. It's done through Christ. But where's the church missing that separation to where then we make power and authority more this kingdom as opposed to Jesus's kingdom that's supposed to enter the transformation?
Yeah, one thing that I've been learning from some high school students in my life via Instagram is that Jesus was killed by cops. I mean, in very contextual language. Like for them, they're like, man, Jesus was put to death by the state. Even in Isaiah, when the government was on his shoulder, like we see it. That's not me trying to eisegete. That's me saying this is what I see. And so if high schoolers are understanding this, I'm like, man, what's the point of going to seminary? Like from the mouth of babes, like they see the truth. I think so. As devastating as it is when a pastor is disqualified from ministry because of sexual sin, I think we turn a blind eye to how equally devastating, if not even more so destructive, pastors who exert a totalitarian or authoritative leadership model are to the church. Like there's something to be said about, man, when a pastor runs off with his secretary, that destroys the church. But there's something to be said about that's even more insidious about a pastor who stays at a church with a long tenure under an abusive power structure and replicates that. And he shepherds and disciples more men into that toxic structure and replicates that structure of power being top down. I mean, just recently, this past week, another well-known pastor in Oregon was relieved of his position as the lead founding pastor by his church elders because of toxic leadership, unrepentant behavior, escalation of aggression, and we don't talk about that. Like, I think there's a case study about Mark Driscoll that needs to be addressed. Like, he was disqualified from ministry, but now he's back in ministry because he didn't sin sexually. His moral failing wasn't sexual, but it was acceptable under our certain current cultural and societal norms of what it means to be a man. And I think that is what ails the church today. And so however we move towards addressing that, however we move towards remedying that, I think the clearest model contemporary model of a pastor that I see is Eugene Peterson. There's something about the ministry of Eugene Peterson where he didn't become famous in the prime of his pastoral ministry. There's wisdom in him waiting to publish once he exited, because he didn't get high on his own stuff. and it was tested, tried, and found to be true. And I think the language in Eugene Peterson will always talk about, like, Wendell Berry. Whenever Wendell Berry writes about the farm, Pearson will replace the word farm with church. So the cultivation of the land, the commitment to locality, to the being a part of the ecosystem and not just a manager of the ecosystem. There's a commitment to die in that place that you oversee. And I think that has implications, very real ethical implications for the way we talk about policing. What would it look like if police officers lived in the very communities that they policed? Take Portland for an example. Portland is the liberal center of Oregon, but the surrounding suburbs are very conservative. And the vast majority of police officers who police Portland come from Canby, Beaverton, West Lynn, Lake Oswego. And so, of course, you have this system of disdain because you have police officers from politically conservative areas coming to right the wrongs of this liberal mecca. I think the same thing with pastors. Pastors need to start living in their communities and being a part of their communities and not just, the power is such
No, living in the community makes a difference because then it's your people. You know what I'm saying? Like if you commute in and out, like one of the things that I think has been the most tragic for the church is the commuter lifestyle. Because then if the church is in an area that we're not, like we hear it all the time here in the area that we live in, Northern California, there's 2 surrounding areas that people avoid because it's not good enough. So they live in our town, and people from those other towns then will commute into just to go to church in our town because there's more economic status here there's more money, and so it's interesting though, but like with the policing, that's a great point. If they live amongst the people, then they know them. So then if they go there, the problem though that we see is that knowledge, because according to some of the stuff that I read with George Floyd, the dude, that cop, they were bouncers together or something like that at a night, and so that's the tragic side of knowing someone, right? So he knew him and didn't like him, but my gut says that he didn't like him because of the color of his skin, nothing more than that, but it makes a point. Community. Jesus, the reason why he was beaten up by the people of his community is because he was in the community. How many pastors can say that they live in their community or they commute out? That was one of the things that we got into with one of the leaders of a church here, and I was discussing with him, and he lives in another town because he has a nicer home and it's less expensive, but he commutes here because he knows that the average income here for weekend tithing is $5,000 to $7,000 more than if he lived in the town that he was at. And Saddleback, you read some background stuff with that. The reason why they chose Orange County, like in the Irvine area, it's got some cash, but to live within the people though, then they're not leading the people though, they're becoming one of the people, and it's that the pursuit then of authority and power. And Driscoll is a case in point, man. No one's going to ever let Ted Haggard, for those of you who don't know anything about Ted Haggard, go Google him in Denver. He used to be one of the main primary people for the evangelical right, the push for the family rights, until what? He got caught snorting coke and having sex with a boy. Dude, you're out. That guy's never coming back into ministry, but Driscoll, you hear some of the stuff that he did, and he was the big a-hole, dude. Yet what does he do? He relocates, and like you said, Tony, everyone's the church will gravitate towards him though because he's got a name, and that name is not stained when it's not sexual sin. You're absolutely right.
And unless people say like, man, this is so sociological and political and not theological, like I think to root it in very Christian terms, Jesus wasn't a commuter. Like
Yeah.
he didn't just the incarnation was not an episode in the life of God. And that's Father John Bear's language from Aberdeen. Like Jesus becoming human wasn't just a like chapter in the life of God. Jesus wasn't commuting through creation. Jesus as a human experiences what you and I experience. So there's something about taking up residence throughout the Gospel of John, Jesus tabernacling, Jesus becoming human in us as he is human. And so to stress and like push on the relationality like component, I think when it comes to power, we need to do away with language of like, God has given me his power to steward, or God calls me to exercise dominion over creation. Like, because I think we get it twisted real quick and then we confuse it and we think that God's power is now our power. Like we exercise our power and therefore we exercise God's power on his behalf. I don't think that's the way it is. I think whatever it means to be the church, it's where individuals come together to become persons. The church is the community where an individual comes to become a person. Mm-hmm. And whatever power looks like in that, I cannot exercise power in a Christ-like manner if it harms your personhood and you become an individual again. Whatever it means for pastors to exercise authority or oversight, it cannot mean an individual basis. But I have to recognize your personhood. One of my friends, she's served in ministry her entire life. She grew up in a pastoral family, and she said that she, in a recent conversation with a pastor in her life, he asked if he had her consent to be her pastor in that moment, to give her pastoral advice. And she was like, that made, in her 26 years of life, never has a pastor ever asked for consent to exercise pastoral authority. And I think there's something there to be said about acknowledging somebody's personhood. Because if you were an individual, you are one among many, and I can do whatever I want as a pastor and give you whatever spiritual sage advice I want. But to acknowledge your personhood is to ask you for permission. I think in the very same way that Mary gives her consent to God as she carries Jesus. When the Spirit comes upon Mary, there is consent in this teenage girl agreeing to house God. And so whatever pastoral ministry looks like, I think we need to investigate the language of consent.
And there's a couple of things, man, but like in light of all the things you were just saying, Tony and Matt, not just living in community, but kind of living in reality. I remember for pastors, I remember being at a church, and we were doing a men's conference, and the lead pastor was doing the opening session to this men's conference, and he got to a point in this talk where it was ready for him to tell a story of how he failed personally, or how he struggled with something morally or something, where he had some sort of struggle, and he just ejected from that moment. And I remember just thinking, this is the setting for you to have that kind of conversation. And for us to see a different side of the suit and tie that we see on Sunday mornings, and just that ability of not being able to connect with people, not being able to just be a part of the group Bible study and share openly rather than lead the group Bible study all the time is a thing. So just living in reality that demonstrates your connection to the community. But Tony, you mentioned a moment ago that we often don't talk about, I don't know if one of you guys mentioned it, but we often don't talk about major pastors that have moral failures. We do talk about it. We just gossip about it and then move on to the next thing. I remember a few years ago, there was maybe over 10 years ago, there were a few pretty famous rappers that were Christian rappers that were really important to just the role of Christian hip hop and just that direction that shifted. A pretty significant moral failure, were dropped from their labels and the like. And we mourned these guys' moral failure because these were guys in some regard that discipled us. So we're like, yo, something happened. Well, what do we do now? Do we accept or forget all the stuff that we learned from them, or what? And just maybe the how we talk about these things, where it's not just, oh man, Pastor such and such did so and so, but it's like, does that impact what he?
Yep, I think the power thing is definitely I think you're finishing up, Phil, but it's like
and will I be able to listen to him again?
I don't know. See, okay. Finishing up the power and the authority, which is I in the sense that I think, right, Phil, just more so talking stuff. And so I think that's something that we have to take into account in the days. What I want to do is continue with this and this idea of, well, what does it mean to procure power though in appropriate ways? If anyone's ever read Soren Kierkegaard, he talks about the purity of heart is to will one thing. And so unpacking that, well, what does it mean for the church? Because I take to your point, Phil, that so often, instead of us wrestling through these aspects, when people teach us and they have a moral failure or they just have a fall, it shouldn't automatically, even Driscoll should not automatically discount them, right? There's redemption and grace, but the question is does the person want that? Does Driscoll have they changed, right? And that kind of thing. And so we want to continue with that. I don't know, Tony, if you have any last thoughts about that. And we totally appreciate you all joining us for this episode. Next week, we want to continue with this. So giving ourselves over, this idea of power and stuff. And so when we bring in someone like Kierkegaard, who says purity of heart is to will one thing, well, that's seeking power, seeking position, seeking personhood. I totally appreciate, Tony, what you're talking about with you find our person in the community, but we don't want to be swallowed up in the community. So keeping that also distinct, because we are still individuals, right? But continuing with this, and how do we do that, especially in light of the unrest going on in today's culture, with the protest and with the crying out. So what is the will of the church? The purity of heart. Does the church have this pure heart in order to then lead the people of the 21st century? So on behalf of Phil and Tony, I'm Matt Farlow. We appreciate and just stoked that you're joining us here for New Wine UnCorked. Check out all of our other episodes. Just check out the playlist. Come on back with us. Every week we're doing this, and we drop the video on the week on Tuesdays. Join us to the comments too. Put your comments up there, have questions, so that we can engage those as well. Because we want to continue pressing this, because I know for Tony and for Phil, like myself, man, I just want to know Jesus. And I want to figure out what does he have in store for me? Because he has something in store for each one of us. And that means you that are watching us, that he loves each one of us so much that he draws us in so that we can truly live out the call of living, to love and to serve one another. And that's the pure power of heaven above, right? Lived out today. So on behalf of my good friends, Phil and Tony, I'm Matt Farlow. This has been New Wine Uncorked. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode. Until the next time, we'll see you on the flip side.